taking us. But Revelation chapter 12, starting verse number 1, it says, "And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. And I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, Now is come salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God, and the power of his Christ. For the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto the end. Therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time. And when the dragon saw that he was cast into the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly unto the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time, and times and half a time, from the face of the serpent. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as of a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. And the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which kept the commandments of God, and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. All right, so as we said, this chapter of Revelation speaks really of the ongoing war between good and evil. And to make it even more specific, between the ongoing war between Satan and Israel. That's really what the war is in this particular chapter. Now, the first battle that we'll talk about just briefly tonight, but the first battle led Satan to the garden in order to bring mankind into the war. The second battle that we see later in chapter 12 denied Satan access to heaven and brought him permanently to the earth, where he knows that his time is limited. And then the last battle is Satan's final persecution against God and his people. And so this chapter, interestingly, covers almost all of time and gives us a look into why the things of Revelation really must take place. If you find yourself asking, well, why do these things have to happen? Well, it's because there's evil in the world. And why is there evil in the world? Well, because of the things that we've read here in chapter 12. And so John begins really this sweeping section of Scripture by noting this particular great wonder here in verse number 1. This great wonder, which means a sign in heaven. That word wonder refers to a sign in heaven. Now, and this kind of goes back to what we talked about when we very first started Revelation. A sign is a symbol of a reality. And so John is telling us that this portion of Scripture, yes, it is symbolic, but it points to something real. It points to a reality. It's not symbolic for symbolic's sake. And so, as I said at the very beginning, I interpret Revelation literally. That does not mean that there are no symbols, that there is no figurative speech used in the book, but what that does mean is that when Revelation uses those particular linguistic tools, that they're using them to point to something that is real, to point to something that is literal. In other words, we talked about this several weeks ago. We were talking about the trumpet judgments, when it refers to the grass and the trees being burned up. If the grass and the trees don't mean grass and trees, what do they mean? Right? There's no possible way to bring to that a real answer if everything is symbolic and it doesn't really mean what it says it means. However, here in chapter 12, it does use symbolic language, but it defines those symbols for us. It doesn't just leave us wondering. It gives us a symbol, and then it helps us to understand what that symbol represents. And so that's what's going on here in verse number 1, and really throughout the chapter. And there appeared a great wonder or a sign in heaven. What was that sign? Here is the sign. A woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. Now this woman is going to be a prominent character, and so it does us well to understand who this particular woman is speaking about. And so this great wonder there, we see it is a woman in heaven. Now, as John tells us already in verse number 1 that this is a sign, this is a wonder, this is a symbol, we know that the woman that he describes is not a literal woman, but it points to a literal reality. Okay, so the description of the woman, and we can tell, I mean, I don't have to tell you that this isn't a real woman in heaven who is clothed with the sun and who's standing on the moon and who has stars as the crown, on her head. I don't have to tell you that that's not literal, but what it is doing is pointing to something that is literal. So what is it pointing to? Now I'll tell you there are really three main interpretations as to who this woman could be. A lot of people think that this is talking of the church. A lot of people think that this is talking of Mary herself, or in my particular opinion, I believe that this is representing Israel, the people, the nation of Israel. And there's a lot of reasons why. I'll give you a few of them, but I believe that the best interpretation here is to take this as this woman is pointing to literal Israel. Now there is a great similarity in this particular vision and what Joseph dreams. If you remember back to Genesis chapter 37, Joseph has this dream. And he dreamed yet another dream and told it to his brethren. He said this, "Behold, I have dreamed a dream more, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me." Now, we understand that he tells his brother this. They're not too happy about that. That leads to a whole lot of other events. But you have the same symbols here being used. You have the sun, you have the moon, and then if you add Joseph into the 11, you have your 12 stars. And so you have the same symbols being used. And obviously, Jacob here is representative of the sun, Jacob becoming Israel, and then his 12 sons becoming the 12 tribes of Israel. And so there's a direct correlation between this and the nation of Israel. And then furthermore, in the Old Testament, it's not uncommon to see the nation of Israel referred to as the wife of God or in feminine terms. In Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 20, "Surely as a wife treacherously departed from her husband, so have ye dealt treacherously with me, O house of Israel, saith the Lord." And so there, the house of Israel, the nation of Israel, is referred to as a woman, obviously an unfaithful woman in this context, but a woman nonetheless. This certainly makes the most sense when you add into the fact that the tribulation, what we've been talking about for a while now, the tribulation is mainly God dealing with his people, Israel. That's what the tribulation mainly is. Now, there are other things taking place, yes, but the tribulation is mainly God dealing with his people, Israel. And so, again, it just makes sense that this woman here is in reference to Israel. And there's a couple other reasons that we'll kind of get to as we go through why I don't think this is either the church or Mary herself. But I do believe that it is the best interpretation here to say that the woman represents Israel. Now here in verse number 2, this woman is seen as being pregnant and travailing in birth there in verse number 2, and pained to be delivered. She's pregnant and she's in a great amount of pain. Now think about this from the perspective of Israel. In the entirety of Israel's history, they have been in travail. In the Old Testament, it was no different. They waited, often impatiently, through tragedy and hardship for the coming of the Messiah. Right? We see that throughout the Old Testament. And then verse 5, not to really get ahead of ourselves, but verse 5 shows us that this pregnancy, the woman was pregnant with the man-child, and that man-child is the Messiah. And again, this is a picture that the woman was not the church, as the church did not give birth to Jesus, but Jesus gives birth to the church. And so it couldn't be the church. That really narrows it down to either Israel or Mary herself. And again, as I told you, I believe this is Israel. But we see that Israel, and it's not any different now, Israel's always, you could kind of see them as in travail. There's really never been a people more hated or more attacked than the Jews, than the Israelites. And you just have to take a cursory look at history to see the facts of how that has played out throughout their entire history. And then verse 3, it says, "And there appeared another wonder in heaven." So there's another sign. "There appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his head. Now, Israel, as we talked about at the beginning, Israel has suffered and travailed at the hand of Satan, as he has done and as he did all that he could to stop the one who would come, who was going to bruise the head of the serpent. Right? This goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, at the fall of man. Right? The punishment handed down to the serpent. There's going to be a seed of the woman who's going to do what? He's going to bruise the head of the serpent, and the serpent's going to bruise the heel of the man. And so this serpent, this man, this great red dragon has always been at a war with God's people because he's trying to stop the one who is going to bruise his head. And so this is where, again, that next sign, that next wonder comes into play here, being this great red dragon. Now, this great red dragon is described as having 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns. Now, again, this is a sign. This is not a literal great red dragon in heaven with all these heads and crowns and all these things, but it is pointing to something that is literal. Now, as if the imagery was not clear enough, we are not left to wonder here, because John actually gives us the interpretation of this in verse number 9. He says, and the great dragon was cast out, and he tells us, that old serpent called the devil and Satan. We don't have to even spend any time wondering who this is. He tells us this is Satan. Now, it is likely here that when it says the great red dragon, it is likely that the color red refers to the bloodshed that has been caused through the continual war between the dragon and the woman, not unlike the second seal when the rider comes on the red horse, again, most likely a representation of the bloodshed that was going to take place. Now, I'm not going to get into this into much depth, because if you turn over to chapter 17, we're going to see this once we get into chapter 17. But in chapter 17, verses 9 through 14, we get a little bit of more information with regards to these heads and these crowns and these horns. But in chapter 17, starting in verse number 9, it says, and here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. And there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. And then verse 14, these shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is the Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. And so, again, I'm not going to get into a lot of depth under this tonight, because we're going to cover this in great detail once we get over there into chapter 17. But suffice to say, without getting ahead of myself, what this depicts is the rule of Satan over the world empires, and how he uses that power in order to attack and battle against the woman or Israel. And so I don't want to really say more about that, because we could spend a lot of time talking about that, and I want to save that for when we get over to chapter 17. So, we'll look forward to that once we get over there. But let's go on here. Verse number 4. Still speaking of the dragon, it says, and his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did catch them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered. Why? For to devour her child as soon as it was born. So what this verse describes here is the fall of Satan. Now, we're not going to take the time to go look up these scriptures. In Isaiah chapter 14 and Ezekiel chapter 28, these are both Old Testament scriptures that refer to the fall of Satan. In Isaiah chapter 14, you'll see that it was the pride of Lucifer that led to his fall. You'll see that this little phrase over and over and over again in Isaiah chapter 14, I will be like the Most High. I will descend. I will do this. I will. There was a great pride in Lucifer, and that pride is what ultimately led to his downfall. And then in Ezekiel chapter 28, another very interesting portion of Scripture, you kind of get a look of how Lucifer was before the fall. In fact, you get a little bit of look at his physical appearance and maybe the position that he held in heaven. But both of these scriptures talk about the fall and the things that took place there. And so what verse 4 here is talking about is when that happened, it says at the beginning of verse 4, his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven. And so in his pride, when he tried to be like God, he fell, and when he fell, he took a third of the angels with him. Now, I don't think that means that he took them by force. I think that means that they joined in the rebellion of Lucifer, and that when he fell, they just went with him. Okay, I don't think that means that he roped a third of the angels and then drug them without their, against their will down. I don't think that's what that means. I think that they were a part of this rebellion and that they were a part of the fall just as much as Lucifer was. He just happened to be the head of it. Now, the dragon, what this tells us is that the dragon does not fight these battles alone. He's not doing this alone, but he has his own angels that work along with him. Now, this is important because we understand that Satan is not omniscient. Satan is not omnipresent. Satan is not omnipotent. And so he can't do all of these things on his own. He has his own army, if you will. And as we have seen, it's a great number. We don't know how many angels there are, but he has a third of however many there are. And we know that there's a multitude of angels, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of angels. And we know, again, for a fact, as we've seen in some of the trumpet judgments, that there are angels now that are kind of locked away, if you will, that number over 200 million. And so we don't know how many he has, but we know that he has a great number that fight alongside of him in this ongoing battle between Satan and this woman. And of course now the church has been involved in that as well, as we understand. But there's been, I think it ought to comfort us tonight to understand that Satan is not all-powerful, and he's not doing this all alone, that he has to have his angels take part in this, or he couldn't do the things that he does. And when we think about this, I think oftentimes people see, they look at Satan and they think that Satan is the direct counterpart of Jesus. That's just patently false. He's not the direct counterpart of Jesus. He pales in comparison to Jesus. He is nothing compared to the power of Jesus, because Jesus is omnipotent. Jesus is omniscient. He is all of these things, and he has all this power. If you want to give a direct counterpart to Satan, you look towards Michael or one of the angels. That's his counterpart. It is not Jesus, okay? And so we got to understand this, that when he fell, he drew a third of the angels with him, and they are involved in this battle against the woman. And I think that's very important for us to understand. And I think, if we think about it from that perspective, it ought to give us some comfort tonight to have a little bit of understanding of the battle that we're in, that he's not all-powerful. He doesn't have that credential under his name, but he does have a third of the angels that rebelled, that fell along with him. Now, as I said, they're at the end of verse number 4. What were they doing? All right, so at the beginning of verse 4, he draws a third of the stars of heaven with him. He casts them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered. Why? To devour her child as soon as it was born. This has been Satan's MO. He wants to devour that child. He's been trying to do it. In fact, we see this right away in the Gospel of Matthew. I don't know how well you can see that up there, but we see this happen immediately. In Matthew chapter 2, it says, Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked with the wise men, he was exceeding wroth. And what did he do? He sent forth and he slew all the children that were in Bethlehem and in all the coasts thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Why did he do this? Because the great red dragon is trying to devour the child. Right? That's exactly why Herod had all these male babies killed, is because he's trying to devour the child. It happened as soon as Jesus, or around the time of his birth, and then later on in Luke chapter 4, Satan comes to him directly, and he's trying to tempt Jesus. And what does he try to do? He tries to take away his authority through the temptation. And then even at one point he tells him, cast yourself off the pinnacle of the temple. And if you truly are the Son of God, the angels will catch you. And perhaps, I don't know, but perhaps Satan was just hoping that he would do it and the angels weren't going to catch him and he was going to splat right there on the ground. But this is Satan trying to devour the child. And then later in the same chapter, Luke chapter 4, the people of Nazareth were so upset at the teachings of Christ that we read this, that they thrust him out of the city and they led him under the brow of the hill whereon their city was built, that they might cast him down headlong. But look how he had to get out of this. But he, passing through the midst of them, went his way. What is this? Is this just a random event? No. This was the dragon trying to rouse people to devour the child. He's been trying to do this all along the way. And we could probably give example after example, and there's so many examples that I would imagine that we don't even have any idea about. But he's been trying to devour the child ever since the child was born, and he's still trying to do it today, even though it looks a little bit differently. But who is this child? Now, of course, we've already talked about this. We already know who this is. But he does go on and talk about this. Verse 5, and she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with the rod of iron. So this child, this man-child as he's described, is going to be the one to rule all nations with the rod of iron. And he was going to be the one who was caught up unto God and to his throne. Now, as we mentioned earlier, this was the Messiah born of the woman Israel. Right? She was pregnant, she was in great travail, and she is the one giving birth to this man-child. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, for unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given. This child is said to rule the nations with the rod of iron, and we're going to talk about this more later on in chapter 19. But as far as ruling with the rod of iron, this is a direct reference to Psalm chapter 2, verse number 9. It says, thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. And so we see this actually fulfilled, at least the beginning of the fulfillment, in chapter 19, as Jesus returns in his triumphant victory there. And we'll see this as we get into chapter 19. But it says, and out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. And he treaded the winepress of the fierceness of the wrath of Almighty God. Again, all of this to show us who exactly this child is, who is it pointing towards. And again, we're going to talk about more of that rod of iron. We're going to talk about that more in chapter 19. And so if it wasn't clear already, and obviously we know who this is, but if it wasn't clear already that this was Jesus, it is made abundantly clear by the last phrase of verse 5 here, that he was caught up unto God and to his throne. This is what we would refer to as the ascension of Christ. In Acts chapter 1, he was caught up to God and to his throne. Why does all this matter? Satan certainly tried to devour the child, and he continues to try and do this today, but he has, and he continues to utterly fail. He tried, and he failed. He keeps trying, and he keeps failing. But here in chapter 12, this is why I had us read the whole thing. We'll see that eventually his... and I don't want to get too ahead of myself here because we'll talk about this next week. But he still, at this point, as we're speaking right now, to some degree, we don't know the maximum of that degree, but to some degree, he has an access to heaven. He has an access to heaven right now where he goes and he accuses the brethren. At some point in the tribulation, that access is cut off, and he's going to be cast down to earth. And what he's going to be doing there for the last 3.5 years of the tribulation is ramping up that persecution. That's what we read there towards the end of chapter 12, because he knows his time is short. And this is really what makes the last half of the tribulation so terrible. It's not just that you have the judgments of God falling down. That's bad enough as it is. But now you have Satan who knows my time is about to be up. And so he basically throws everything that he possibly can at Israel because, why? He's trying to continue to devour the child. And so that leads us to verse number 6. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So Satan, knowing that he has failed, And knowing, as I said, that his time is short, he moves from the child back to the woman. And this is what he does at the end of the tribulation. He moves from the child back to the woman. He ramps up his persecution as Israel has never, they've never really stopped being persecuted, right? I mean, as I said earlier, we can't really look at any point in Israel's history and say, well, there's a time where they had extended peace. That's never really happened for them. So their persecution never really stopped. But it is definitely going to be ramped up here in the last half of the tribulation. And so what's happening here in verse number 6 is Satan is going to attack, but God is going to shelter. So Satan is going to attack, but God is going to shelter. Go ahead and go back to Matthew chapter 24, because Jesus speaks about this. In Matthew chapter 24, starting in verse number 15. Matthew chapter 24, verse number 15, it says, when ye therefore, of course this is the Olivet Discourse, he's talking about end times here. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, and he says, whoso readeth, let him understand. Now, just to take a brief pause there, we've talked about this, we're not going to go into more detail, but we've talked about this a lot. The abomination of desolation, that is the midpoint. That is a set, determined midpoint of the tribulation. Daniel talks about it. Jesus talks about it. We'll see it again in chapter 13 of Revelation. It is a set point in the tribulation. It is at the midpoint. So verse 16. So Jesus says, when you see that happen, understand this. Verse 16. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let them which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And he says, and woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And so this is exactly what Jesus is referencing here, when we talk about in verse number 6 of chapter 12. When they see the abomination of desolation, when they see this take place, when the Antichrist comes down and he sets himself up as God and demands to be worshipped, because at this point, as we'll see next week in Revelation chapter 6, as Satan has now been denied access, he's in the earth and he's using the Antichrist to ramp up this persecution. Jesus says, don't even come to your house to pack a bag. When you see that, get out, because things are going to be worse now than they have ever been in the history of mankind. Don't wait. You flee. You get away. And so verse 6 here tells us that there is a place that has been prepared of God. Now, we don't know exactly where this is. A lot of people suggest that it may perhaps be Petra in Jordan. If you've ever seen pictures of Petra, it is kind of a logical choice. The city itself is carved right into the stone there. In fact, the only way to enter into the city is through a rather slender carving in the rock itself. Is probably, in fact, less than this aisle right here. And so it's naturally defended. You can't send a whole army in there because only a couple of people can go in simultaneously. And so, again, I don't know if that's where it is. A lot of people think it is. And in fact, funnily enough, a lot of people think that since they think that Petra is going to be the place, they have actually stashed Bibles and gospel literature all over the city, so that if this is the place where it is going to be, when the Jews go into the city, they will have Bibles and they will have the gospel there to read. And so I've heard of men who've taken Bibles and kind of stashed them around the city of Petra. Again, I don't know if that's where it's going to be. We're not told. But what we are told is that God is going to miraculously shelter them there for the duration of the second half. And so we know that it will be a time of shelter, that it's going to be a time of protection, and then it's going to be a time of provision by God. And again, we know that it's for the entire second half, as it says there at the end of verse 6, that they should feed her there 1,260 days, 1,260 days, or 3.5 years. And so they're going to be taken, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, but we know, if we don't have any other scriptures on this, we know from this, if nothing else, that there will be people who survive the tribulation who go into the millennium in their natural bodies. They're going to live. They're going to survive through. Now, I think there's going to be others than just this group of people. But if nothing else, this group is going to make it through in their natural-born bodies. But again, what do we see here in chapter 12? Ultimately, we see the dragon making war with Israel, making war against the child. And then again, the same thing happens in the tribulation, making war against the woman, Israel. And so this is what he has done since day one, basically. You go back to Genesis chapter 3. Why did Satan do that? This is why. Right? I mean, he hates God. He wants to come against God. He wants to devour his people. He wants to devour the child. And then, of course, as I said earlier, the church has kind of been incorporated into that now. And so we're in this battle as we speak right now. But this gives us a little bit of a preview as to how this is going to take place in the tribulation, when this persecution is ramped up to a scale that is heretofore unseen. And so, again, just a terrible, terrible time in the earth's history, in the history of the people of God, as they have been through time and event after event themselves. But just a terrible, terrible time, a great tribulation such has not been since the world began. So that is the introduction there to Revelation chapter 12. Again, another unique chapter in the book of Revelation.